You know, every year in the spring, the Grackles return, and I have come to watch for them. This year it was on March the 6th. Maybe they're in your yard too. Grackles, if you aren't aware of them, are black birds. I always thought of them as pretty common. They're a little bit larger than robins, and they're slender, and when you look kind of a little bit closer, they seem to have in certain lights have a glossy sheen. They have yellow eyes, and their heads are often tilted up. They often seem to be looking up. I never paid a whole lot of attention to them. There are lots and lots. They seem to flock around my backyard, and I just thought of them as common birds. But recently, a grackle died in my driveway. And I picked it up because I took it over to bury it over under a shrub so that it could decompose and nature would go back to nature. And I was amazed at how beautiful it was. I had never seen it up close. When you take a look, grackles are iridescent. They are iridescent blue and green and purple and bronze. And they're all the colors can be very modulated and at the same time in some places really distinct and bright. I just was amazed at how beautiful this bird was, and also at the fact I'd never noticed. I just thought, a grackle black bird. Hadn't noticed how beautiful it was. And I think that we often do that. That is, we look, but we really don't see. We take things for granted. And I'd like to suggest that right there is a really profound spiritual issue. Looking and really seeing. And there's something a very deep spiritual issue involved here. And that's what I want to look at tonight. How looking or seeing, and I'm suggesting they're two different things, touches right to the heart of our practice. And I want to begin this tonight with an exercise. Would you kind of pass these around? Everyone, if you would take one rock, Tom, and pass it around. Yeah, quickly take one rock and just pass it around. Otherwise, we'll kind of take a while doing this. This can be your rock for the evening. And I'm going to be asking you to look at your rock. And those of you who are sitting on the side, if you come get a rock. You can still sit on the side, but when it comes around, just make sure you pick one up. Thanks, Holly. Great. One rock. And so right now, I'm going to ask you just to really look closely at your rock. Noticing everything you can about this rock. We're going to take a couple of minutes here. Noticing the color and the modulations of color and the shape, the texture. The various planes. Maybe there's some inclusions with other kinds of rocks. And now that you've looked, I'll ask you to close your eyes and see if you can envision your rock in all its details with your eyes closed. And now maybe you'd like to open your eyes and check it out against your rock. Maybe you've noticed, whoops, there are great big places and spaces that you really aren't quite sure of. Various planes. Why not close your eyes again and see if maybe you have a better inner picture of what your rock looks like right now that you've looked again. Maybe you want to use your fingers just to feel it, even while you keep your eyes closed. Remember the planes and the surfaces. Let's try one more time with open eyes. This is appreciating your rock. And so one more time, closing your eyes, seeing if you have a better picture of it. And now I invite you to open your eyes again, and I thank you. Maybe you've noticed this is not such an easy thing to do. At least it wasn't for my rock. There's a lot to notice. A lot to notice. And I would like to suggest at the end of the talk, after we're over this evening, if you'd like to put your rock back into this container, you're welcome. Or if you feel you'd prefer to keep it, you're welcome to keep it too. So, wondering if one time looking wasn't enough. I suspect it wasn't nearly enough. It wasn't for me. In fact, 3 times looking wasn't quite enough for me either. We could look and look and still see more, the more that we look. And I'd like to suggest that many times this is what happens in our life, isn't it? We don't really notice the characteristics of a particular whatever being, object, situation. The mind actually is very naturally notices the major characteristics. For the rock, it would be, a color or general shape or the general texture. That's what we notice first. That's what the mind notices first. And it takes a lot of looking to really begin to notice in detail. To really notice in detail. We tend to predict on the basis of general characteristics. You see something, whatever. It doesn't have to be a rock, whatever. And we decide, is this safe? That's the first thing. Is it safe? Do I like it? Is it appealing? Is it useful? Is it dangerous? That's what the mind does, just like that. That's the way the human mind works. And on one hand, we can call that stereotyping. And we need to be able to classify, because if we didn't, we'd live in chaos. But on the other hand, as we all know, there's a big problem with simply stereotyping, assigning general characteristics. We hear it in the news all the time, don't we? How easy it is to assign meanings to things, to categories, meanings that perhaps are only partly true, meanings that don't take into consideration all the individual characteristics. Possibly, and in the news, we often hear people simply close down to the richness of the diversity that exists. Again, looking only at the general characteristics. And I'd suggest that's not only in the news. We do it ourselves. And I think that the example with the rocks, I hope can kind of illustrate that. I mean, I'm sure that you at least know the color. Your rock was generally brown or red or beige, or maybe some of them are black, I think, with white spots or something like that. I think you notice that. I think you notice the feel of your rock. But the general characteristics, that's one thing. The specific are something else. Yogi Berra, a great Zen master, he made one of his famous comments, and he said, you can observe a lot by watching. It's like, right. And the problem is, we don't usually do that. We don't usually look. In fact, what we do is we hop on to what our mind says as opposed to what our eyes see. We get right into our mind as opposed to being present with what we see. With what we see. So I'd like to ask you, as you were looking at your rock, did you talk about it to yourself? I mean, did you have a front and a back, an up and a down? I kind of did. It's a natural way of trying to orient ourselves, isn't it? I mean, especially you've got this new object, you're trying to look at it, you've been asked to look at it. So a natural thing to do is to kind of get your bearings and see it from what might be the front and the top and the bottom. And of course we can recognize, there's some dangers in that, aren't there? We're projecting something extra onto the rock, namely top, bottom, front, back. And again, on one hand, it's natural. But on the other hand, we're seeing something that actually isn't there. Thoughts in our mind. When we project onto people or onto objects or places that which isn't there, then we come up with something that is not real. That's what's in our mind. And what comes to my mind, I've mentioned it here before, Desolation Canyon in Utah. Now, clearly, to the animals and plants and rocks that are in Desolation Canyon, it's a paradise. They thrive, right? But whatever human beings named that place, this was their projection, and that's what's come down. There's a little picture in the Sierra engagement calendar, a yearly engagement calendar this year of Desolation Canyon. We do that. We project. Recognizing that. And I wanted to ask, did you get bored? even during these, maybe 5, 7 minutes. Possibly getting a little bored with your rock, like, okay, I've seen it. Maybe I don't know it perfectly, but, I got the general gist, and the mind wants to move on. Minds do that, don't they? Very common for minds. Our mind, the mind, wants stimulation, especially our Western minds. We're so used to massive stimulation all the time that something like a rock and giving attention to a rock can get kind of boring after a while. So the mind wants to hop onto something new, even before it's really seen what is right in front of it. Now, of course, we can't do that all the time. If we were to even try to really see every rock in a gravel driveway, for example, well, good luck. How long would that take? Huge amounts of time. And as I was thinking of that, it seemed to me like a Grimm's fairy tale where the princess was assigned to see all the rocks in a day, something magical like that. We just can't do that. We don't have time to do that. And yet we need at the same time to recognize what we are doing. And that is we're really generalizing. Another question. Did your rock trigger thoughts for you about maybe other rocks you know or have seen, maybe rocks you saw on a beach or on a river, or anything else did it trigger any other thoughts? Like, oh yeah, I've got to get gravel for my driveway or whatever. The mind does that too, doesn't it? It's so easy to hop away and move on, and the mind just kind of skitters around doing that. And then we can go back and we can invest this particular little rock with the memories of other rocks I saw on the beach last year, or memories, maybe emotional content invested in this rock. It had nothing to do with this rock, but it's with our memories and who we are, and then we can get attached. So I'm suggesting it's really important that we notice how the mind works. It is part of our spiritual practice. Noticing what your mind, not just what it's saying, but how it works. And I've just raised some of the issues and the ways it just can work with just one rock. Our practice is called vipassana. That's a Pali word. We do insight meditation. But the ancient Pali word for this meditation is called vipassana, which means to see things as they truly are. To see things as they truly are. And how often we don't. And what's the point of seeing things as they truly are? We begin to recognize how your mind gets in the way and does the kind of thinking we've just been talking about that prevents us from seeing what's true. The mind goes off into all of its little tangents. Vipassana, or seeing things as they truly are, applies both on the everyday level of a little rock, our everyday conventional reality, and seeing things as they truly are also is applicable to the level of the ultimate reality as well. It refers both to the conventional, what we see all around us, the beings, the people, the rocks, the objects, the situations, and also to the ultimate. And I want to turn now and talk about seeing and ultimate reality. The usual way we look at people or objects or situations, the usual way we do that, we create a sense of a separate self just by the way we look. We create and have self-centered thoughts just by the way we look at things. Just to think. And I've raised several ways that you might have done that with your rock. I certainly did with my rock, thinking of top and bottom. That basically is a self-centered thought, meaning it is helping you, a self, orient yourself with regard to that rock. If you thought of any stories, if it triggered any thoughts, again, self-centered thought. We can call this kind of working of the mind, this creating a sense of self. We can call it selfing. That's what the mind does. It selfs. It's a verb. We can always self. We always do self. We see in our rocks, people, places, situations, we see what we like there. We see what we don't like. We project onto others, other people, other places. Have you ever heard the story that, or the little saying that to a hammer, everything is a nail. To a pickpocket, everything is a pocket. Everyone is a pocket. Or the world is our mirror. We're always projecting who we are onto what's out there, the way we see it, and react accordingly. And our training is to begin to notice that, in fact, that's what we're doing. We're selfing. We're creating a self as we go through the world, and we respond to how we have projected. So just for a moment, I will ask you just to think, did you at any time while you were looking at this rock, did you self? Did selfing happen? I think it probably did. Maybe for all of us. It did for me. So what's the problem, you might ask, with selfing? You know, everybody does it. Everybody does it almost all the time. So why is it even an issue? Well, the first reason why it's an issue is because it's not true. Ultimately, it is untrue that there is a separate self in the way we think that there is. Ultimately, there is selflessness. The Buddha, all of the great spiritual teachers, and eventually your own spiritual practice as well will show you directly the truth of that. Maybe it has, some of you have glimpsed it, maybe it hasn't yet, not a problem. That's where it leads, and this is what the Buddha said. He taught about no self. He talked about no self. This is a radical sense of selflessness. It's not the kind of selflessness where we give our seat to old ladies or people with disabilities in a public place. That's not what it's talking about. It's much more radical than that. This kind of selflessness means that you are not the self that you think you are, the limited self, who has all these characteristics of your history and your likes and your dislikes and your weaknesses and so forth. You're really not only that. Not ultimately. Ultimately, you're something else. You could even say, to be kind of controversial, it's a hoax. I know that's a kind of controversial, but maybe it'll kind of raise attention. You know, we get deluded. It's a delusion to think we're a separate self. Our hearts know intuitively this truth. Our minds don't necessarily, but our hearts know it. The problem is we usually don't listen to our hearts knowing here. Our minds want to jump in, just as it jumped in as you were looking at the rock and created a self. This is what the Buddha was pointing to ultimately in his teaching, time and again. He said existence has three characteristics. No self, selflessness, which is the Pali word for it is anatta, impermanence, and unsatisfactoriness. And in the second talk that he gave as a teacher in his long, long years of teaching, the second one was called the Discourse on Selflessness. This was a discourse that he gave to 5 disciples, his first followers. Now, the first talk he gave was a talk that kind of laid out all of the characteristics of the Four Noble Truths. We've talked about that many times, the Four Noble Truths. I won't talk about it now. But he had met up with, after he had his enlightenment, he met up again with these 5 individuals, 5 seekers, and they became his first disciples. And he gave his first talk about the Four Noble Truths. And then about a week later, it was about a week later, he gave his second talk. He decided that these disciples had progressed enough that they were ready to hear the truth of no self. So his second discourse, which is called the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, which means the discourse on selflessness. And what did he say in the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta? He said that those things that we identify with as self are mistaken. What do we identify with? Well, we identify with our bodily form. Say, that's me. Or we identify with our feelings. This is pleasant, that's unpleasant, that's kind of neutral either way. We identify with our perceptions. We identify with the way our mind works, our thoughts and our emotions. That's me, my thoughts, my emotions. How often we have talked about that. We identify with consciousness. We say, finally, after all, I'm my consciousness. That's who I am. Buddha said that's not so. Now, he wasn't asking his disciples to believe it. He was asking them to practice with it. And this is what's radical about the Buddha's teaching. He's not asking you to believe it, because this is hard to believe. I mean, I think if you sit there and you think, what, I'm not my body? This is a hard sell. What, I am my body. When it hurts, I hurt. And so forth. He said, practice. Really look deeply. These 5 characteristics, 5 aggregates he later was to call them, it really ultimately isn't who you are. It isn't who you are. Now, let me say also, he's not denying that we exist as embodied human beings. It gets subtle. It's a bit subtle. He's not saying, no, you don't exist as an embodied human being. Of course we do. But he's saying that's not the whole story. That's not the end of it. That ultimately the story is we are selfless. There is no self there. Some people, not the Buddha, have used the image of a car. Obviously it wasn't the Buddha. Like the car. We think of car and we know the makes and the models and the years and so forth. But really, what is a car? It's a combination of a lot of different parts, and every part is a further combination of a lot of other parts. Where is the carness of car? It's kind of an analogy. But finally, as I said, the Buddha said we need to practice with it. Not believe. It's not about believing it. Even if you see the logic of it, he's asking us to directly experience the truth of it. This is what he's asking about. So the first problem with selfing is that it's misleading. It isn't ultimately true. There's a second problem with selfing. And the second problem is that selfing creates suffering. This is the problem that usually gets our attention. The first one, the not ultimately true, is, I can put it aside. The second one, that one is hard to put aside. We can be even, when we are really deeply suffering, then we can be even willing to open to the possibility that there is no self. Oh my gosh. It's a hard one to look at, but when we're suffering, we want relief, however we might obtain it. Selfing is the origin of suffering, the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows as a result of suffering. There's a very famous and beautiful poem by a Zen patriarch. He was the 30th Zen patriarch. And he said, ultimately, the way is not difficult for those who give up picking and choosing. Ultimately, the way, he meant the way to truth, is not hard. Just give up picking and choosing. Now, he's not talking there about choosing whether you want tofu or fish for dinner, for example. He is talking about choices in a different way, about the way we tend to be really dissatisfied if we don't get what we have chosen, whatever it may be. We kind of cling to it, and satisfied when we get it. It feels good. That's selfing, On that level, on a very subtle and deep level, he was talking. So selfing creates suffering. I wanted this, and I want this, and I don't want that, and I don't want that. We live our lives like that. And of course, on one level, we need to. This is the subtlety of it. We really need to hear. This really requires subtle understanding. We need to make choices. I mean, how could you even walk out the door if you haven't made choices? But more deeply than that, he is saying, notice where you're clinging, where you're grasping. That's selfing, right there. The clinging and the grasping. The feeling dissatisfied when it hasn't happened. That's the selfing. And by the way, I'm just going to say really quickly, we should not don't blame yourself. I mean, this is the next thing. When we first hear this, it's so easy to think, oh, I'm so terrible. I just do all the wrong things. No, this is all about everything. Be kind, just notice. Just notice what's going on. Oh yeah, selfing is going on. Just noticing. I think in spiritual practice, a lot of us are into damage control. We very much want and practice so that we can more deeply appreciate and experience the good stuff, the 10,000 joys. We want to be able to be appreciative and grateful and to truly experience it deeply. That's great. And our spiritual practice helps us do that. Now, 10,000 sorrows is a whole different story. Because, of course, who wants them? Nobody. Nobody wants the 10,000 sorrows. So what I think many of us are doing in our practice is trying to learn how to avoid the 10,000 sorrows. Or, if we've got to face them, how can we do that skillfully? And again, there's nothing wrong with being skillful. That's a good idea. Important to be skillful. The problem is, though, it's where we're coming from when we do that. When we are skillful or not so skillful, we can create a sense of self, whether we're enjoying a joy or whether we are working to deal with sorrow. If we're doing that from a sense of self, we then reinforce that sense of self, don't we? We can say, wow, I did a pretty good job handling this pretty miserable situation. And I did a pretty skillful job there. As long as we are feeling, or I did a horrible job, I just messed it up entirely. Both of them are selfing. Do you see? It is where we're coming from that is the issue. It's deeper than whether we are handling it well or not. Does that make sense? It's deeper. It's coming from a deeper place. So, we occasionally quote a trenchant little verse by a Zen master named Wei Wu Wei. Wei Wu Wei was not Chinese, although his name sounds like it. He was Irish, and he lived in the 20th century. And he was a very witty, many trenchant, really incisive little verses. And he said, "Why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you think and everything you do is for yourself, and there isn't one." And that sums it up. There isn't one. There isn't one. So I think that for us, a key question, whether you feel that you have glimpsed selflessness or whether it's like still a mystery to you, there's a key question that we need to ask ourselves. And that is, and I put ourself in quotes here, language is so difficult to deal with, but a key question to ask is, what do you really want from your spiritual practice? Finally, what is most deeply, what it is that do you want? And for some of us, it might just be able to get through life with less pain. So for some of us, however, the answer might be I really most deeply want to align with ultimate reality, with wholeness. I want to align with that which is sacred. Aligning my life, experiencing it directly. I think that it's really important for you to be clear, for each one of us to be clear. What most deeply do I want from this practice? And not to forget it. Yes, to practice our mindfulness and all the other important and powerful practices that we have. But to bear in mind, what is it that you most deeply want? And if it is to align your life with that which is sacred, with wholeness, to keep it in mind, not to forget it. The image of the astronauts planting their flag up on the moon, the American flag right there. Well, I think that we can plant our own flag. That is, know for sure what your territory that you wish to claim. This is wholesome desire. What is it that you most deeply want? Plant your flag there and keep it in mind. And I say keep it in mind. Well, let me say, it's so easy in our society, particularly if it has something to do with recognizing wholeness, which at the same time means recognizing selflessness, because your part in wholeness is not just little self in a great big whole, but it has a whole different meaning, an entirely different meaning. Keeping in mind what your inner highest desire is, because as I said, in our society, it is so easy to forget it. We are bombarded all the time with just a huge amount, a huge array of different kinds of considerations. There's so much to know, so many factors to bear in mind. It's very easy. We could actually almost go through life and never even hear or think again about selflessness and about wholeness. We can duck out of it. What are the books, the stories, the movies? What are they all about? Plot-driven, circumstances, right? Most of them. And sometimes, yes, there is growth that goes on, but touching into selflessness and to the wholeness that ultimately is reality, that's rare to come across. As I said, the Buddha was one of the rare teachers in human history, and there are other great spiritual teachers, but who really talked about it. So the invitation is to invite you, not to rationalize it away like, oh, I'm too busy right now, or, boy, let me get through this first and then I'll get to that. It's all along, in the midst of our difficulties and in the midst of our joys. This truth doesn't disappear. So then the question comes, okay, so if in fact we have planted our flag in the territory of wholeness, selflessness, what do we do about that as we live our life? And I think part of the answer is to be bothered by it, but not to worry. At Shasta Abbey, which is a Zen monastery where I lived for a couple of years, they have a saying, it's good to be bothered by the truth. Let it nag you. Just like, not to forget it. To be bothered by it, but not to worry. Let it be there inside, but not to worry if at times you tend to forget it. If indeed it's your deepest truth, you won't forget forever. It's in there. Relax with it. There is no way you can lose it, because ultimate truth isn't lost. It's always there. Whether you're thinking about it or not, it's there, right? Why worry? Gently coming back. Oh, yeah, this is it. No stress. It's going to be there always for you, no matter what you're doing, no matter how horrible your day is or you feel you are, or how incompetent or unworthy or all that stuff that we tend to project inward on ourselves. It doesn't matter to ultimate truth. Ultimate truth is always there. And it's always what you are. Always. So I think, finally, this is a way in which each of us can relax. This is a relaxation that's deeper than the stress of your day. Do you see? It goes even deeper. We're always being held by ultimate truth. Always. And I just wanted to finish with one little quote by the poet, Sufi poet Hafiz, who said, "We are just a midair flight of golden wine between his pitcher and his cup." Just a midair flight of golden wine between his pitcher and his cup. That's it. All of us. So thank you for listening.